I must admit, I find GPS technology quite amazing. I just don't trust it. I'm what you might call a reluctant adopter. I like maps. I like to know where I am. I like to plan my own route and the routes of others. Just ask my kids. I like figuring things out, trusting my own instincts, giving people directions. But this summer, I think I finally learned to really appreciate the value of GPS. Our Waze and Google Maps apps became indispensable on our trip this summer to help our youngest daughter, Michelle, move to Cambridge, Massachusetts for graduate school. As usual, I argued frequently with the GPS. And as usual, the GPS always won. Now, I frustrate my wife, Amy, whenever I ask her what the next turn is going to be just moments before the GPS voice calmly announces that very turn. And I won't be that surprised if one day my GPS says to me, "Be patient, trust me, I was just about to tell you." Now, I did learn to rely especially on the GPS when I was driving alone around the Boston metro area, picking up and delivering the used furniture purchases that Michelle and her roommate had made for their new apartment. Moving furniture, you see, for me, is often my sermon inspiration. Some of you may even remember a few years ago on the high holidays, me moving a sofa into my basement. That infamous sofa became wedged in the stairwell of our house, and I shared on the High Holy Days some of the lessons I learned then about humility, about planning, about asking for help, about trust, and about accepting change. But this year it was a beautiful solid wood dining room table and chairs from Facebook Marketplace that taught me about empathy and kindness, even in unexpected places and moments. The friendly human-like voice living inside my GPS was guiding me successfully across complicated routes throughout Boston, and I arrived at that apartment where I was supposed to be picking up that table. The seller told me how much he loved the table, but that it was simply too large for his family's dining room, as we were struggling to fit it into the back of our rented van. I drove across Boston alone, intent on the voice of the GPS, arriving at Michelle's apartment tired, sweaty, and extremely frustrated after a 45-minute, 3.5-mile trip. Michelle and I unloaded the heavy table, slowly walking down the street, stopping several times to rest and to catch our breaths. Oy, I thought to myself, why me? Why us? This table is really heavy, and my back really hurts, and I'm not as young as I used to be. And just when we were ready to give up, a car stopped next to us in the middle of a busy street. The driver, a large guy wearing a Boston Fire Department logo t-shirt, jumped out, leaving his car literally in the middle of the street. "Let me help you with that," he said, approaching Michelle's end of the table. "No, we're okay," we said to him, relieved when he responded, "No way, I insist. You need help, and that's why I'm here." He grabbed the end of the table and he easily lifted it, and we continued around to the front of the house where Amy and Michelle had propped the front doors open. After a couple of failed attempts to get the table through the narrow entrance and into the apartment, we retreated. I thanked our Good Samaritan. I said to him, "We'll have to take the legs off the table and that you can go if you need to." "No way," he said. "I am here to help you." And then he continued, "I'm not from around here. not so subtly implying something I'm not sure what about his opinion about people from New England. I grew up in the South, you see, and my mama always taught me that when you see somebody struggling, someone who needs your help, you help, no matter who they are, stranger or not. So you're stuck with me, he said. I'm here to help. I suggested then that we try the back door before removing the table's legs, even though it seemed difficult. And he helped me carry the table from the front around to the back of the apartment. And then together we manipulated this very large, heavy table up the stairs and through the door frame and somehow got it around the kitchen and into the dining room. We thanked him. He was our new friend, after all. We offered him to have a cold drink, but he said, "No, I need to get to work now. I'm an EMS at the fire department and I can't be late." "Thanks, though," he said. "No, thank you," we said to him. After he left, we talked for a few minutes about how nice he was, how he hadn't needed to stop at all, and how grateful we were that he did, and how he might just make it into my Yom Kippur sermon. Because this man, a complete stranger who had little in common with us, driving by, minding his own business, saw us struggling. And he didn't hesitate to stop and offer us a hand in this random act of kindness. But I think it was something more than that. For this man seemed to have his own built-in GPS, his moral GPS, his 21st century version of the moral compass, which according to the Oxford Dictionary is a person's ability to judge what is right and wrong and to act accordingly. We all have inside of us a moral compass, a moral GPS, but recently it seems many of us, Americans, Jews, and many, many others, have lost sight of the right direction. Some of us seem to have forgotten some of the most important lessons that our parents taught us, that our faith and the faith of others teach about empathy and kindness and paying attention to and listening to and experiencing what the other is going through. Not only feeling sorry for ourselves, not only being blinded by our own needs or fears. Our moral GPS tells us that our own individual selfish needs are not more important than and may actually be less urgent than the needs of others. In an age of increasing individualism, we seem to have lost sight of the critical importance of working for the common good. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is designed precisely to recalibrate our moral direction. This time of teshuvah, of return, to return to kindness and caring and justice and honesty and empathy and love, the core of our Jewish tradition, the core of our people, the core of our faith. And as resistant as I am, I've learned how easy it is to just follow the GPS. Because here's the secret. You just have to pay attention. We don't have to ignore our own sense of direction or our love of finding our own way. We just have to listen, because our moral GPS tells us what to say and do and how to live and act. So what does our Jewish moral compass, our GPS, tell us? Rabbi Hillel's voice speaks from our GPS. In his oft-quoted teaching, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me? Yet if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when?" Wise words to repeat over and over again. Difficult words to make a real part of our lives. The voice in our GPS tells us to rise above self-interest, not just what is good for me or what is good for my family or what is good for my people or people like me or for the Jews, but what is good for all of us. The voice in my moral GPS, our moral GPS, speaks with the words of Torah. Love your neighbor as yourself. You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress them, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. The voice of our Jewish moral GPS speaks in the voice of the founders of the State of Israel, who in 1948 declared in their Declaration of Independence, the State of Israel will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all of its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom and justice and peace as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants. Irrespective of religion and race or sex, it will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. Their vision for the State of Israel, for the Jewish people, for all of us, is that we will listen and actually pay attention to our ancient moral GPS. To this end, academic and journalist Peter Beinart recently wrote that nothing is as likely to make us rethink our views on being Jews or supporters of Israel as listening to the Palestinians. For us as Jews, this might be as good a place to start as anywhere. Now, this past June, many of you know, Amy and I were privileged to travel to Israel as chaperones for Nifty and Israel's teen programs at a time when very few tourists were being admitted to the country. And it was an unusual time to visit, and so I chose to make an effort to take Peter Beinart's advice seriously, listening to the voice of Palestinians as well as the voice of Israelis and Jews like myself, whose voices, frankly, I have heard all my life. And so I contacted Breaking the Silence, an organization of veteran soldiers who have served in the Israeli military and taken it upon themselves to expose the public to the reality of everyday life in the occupied territories, to stimulate public debate about the price paid for a reality in which young soldiers are engaged in the control of a population's everyday life. Many oppose the work of Breaking the Silence, both in Israel and in the United States. It is uncomfortable to hear what these former IDF soldiers have to say. It is uncomfortable to accept the truth of their testimony. But rejection does not deter them. And it does not make their words untrue. Often called liars, killers of Israelis, and worse, they do not cease to speak. And I was called to listen. I was given a private day tour to Hebron and the South Hebron Hills by the Breaking the Silence education director and one of their soldiers who had given testimony. Now, I have visited Hebron many times before over the years, but never quite like this. And I did my best to just listen and watch and learn, allowing my moral GPS to guide me. We walked the streets of Hebron where more than 35,000 Palestinians live in the shadow of 2,000 Israeli soldiers who are stationed there, assigned to protect 600 Israeli Jewish settlers who reside in the heart of a city that was once a thriving, multicultural place of Arab and Jewish coexistence. Palestinians are not permitted to move freely. They are banned from almost all of the streets and neighborhoods. And the few who have remained living in their homes where they have lived for generations, live behind barbed wire and screens that have been erected to prevent them from attacks from the militant Jewish youth hoping to drive them out of their homes once and for all. One elderly Palestinian woman spoke of how she is trapped in her home because she is not permitted to even use the front door of her house on the now Jewish-only street. And so she must climb to the top of her apartment and onto the roof and over several neighboring roofs in order to leave her apartment to go to the market. My moral GPS found it difficult not to be drawn in sympathy over and over again. We stood in a lovely park built by the Jewish state near the spot where the Jewish murderer Baruch Goldstein is buried and mourned as a hero by the Jewish settlers there, despite the fact that in 1994 he murdered 29 Muslim worshippers at the Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron, a site as sacred to Muslims as to Jews. My moral GPS was outraged, and I was deeply saddened and ashamed by the apparent failure of the GPS of so many of my fellow Jews. Driving a few kilometers south into the South Hebron Hills, we visited the current site of the Palestinian village of Khirbet Susia. Susia was at one time a thriving Palestinian village occupied by cave-dwelling Palestinians for several hundred of years. But in 1986, Susia was declared a Jewish archaeological site, and all of the Palestinian residents were expelled when a synagogue was unearthed there. Relocated to a small, almost uninhabitable area nearby in the desert, the Palestinians established the new Susia, which has subsequently been repeatedly demolished by the IDF, their land and water confiscated under questionable legal justifications that leave them scrambling over and over again to regain their livelihood against all odds. We spent several hours there in the ramshackle home of Nasser Nawaja, a field worker for an organization known as B'Tselem, and a resident of Susia, fighting for dignity and freedom to remain on this land that his family was given, to remain there through nonviolent means. This gentle young man welcomed me into his home for lunch and conversation, which his wife cooked and which his young children served us. Nasser, like most of his people, is a peace-loving man, enduring great prejudice and hatred, along with regular attacks aimed at them and their sheep and their land and their wells and their homes. The Jewish settlers who harass them hope that eventually they'll just give up and move elsewhere, to another Palestinian village further away, or out of Israel entirely to Jordan or Egypt or someplace else. But Susia, you see, is their home, as is the village of Atwani, the home of another Palestinian activist we met named Basil, who told us similar stories of harassment. The next day, my friend Rabbi Arik Asherman picked me up at 5 a.m. to drive me to the North Jordan Valley, north of Jerusalem, to volunteer with other activists to accompany Palestinian shepherds as they drove their sheep across the same lands that they have been grazing for generations. Why, you might ask, do these shepherds need to be accompanied by you, Rabbi? Well, I'll tell you, because they are routinely harassed and attacked by Jewish settlers living in illegal settlements in the West Bank, who have hopes of convincing these Palestinians to give up, to abandon their land and leave, thus justifying their claims to the land that the Palestinians would then be no longer using. Western volunteers and Israeli peaceniks get up daily to walk with these gentle shepherds and to pull out our cell phones and to document the violence and harassment when it does occur. I walked for several hours with these shepherds, One in particular, a man about my age, and his sons and grandsons, as they drove their few dozen sheep across the barren, rocky terrain. Thankfully, we encountered no harassment that morning, but when we reached their destination, they thanked us warmly and kindly just for walking with them. And then my day concluded in East Jerusalem, first in the controversial neighborhood suburb of Silwan, just south of the Old City, where the Palestinians who have been living there since the founding of the State of Israel or before are desperately trying to hold on to their homes, while all around them, Jewish settlers are trying to drive them out using legal and illegal means. I ended up finally in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. You may have heard Sheikh Jarrah in the news in May and June. And there I met Mohammed Sabah, an elderly gentleman who spoke to me about his family's long ties to this land and this neighborhood. He was born in the Arab town of Jaffa, now a Jewish suburb south of Tel Aviv. But his family was forced to relocate to Sheikh Jarrah in 1947 when they were driven out of Jaffa during the War of Independence. And they were given a deed, an actual legal deed to their land in Sheikh Jarrah by the then Jordanian government who was in charge of that land. But now they face Israelis and the Israeli government attempting to force them out of those homes so that they can build Jewish apartment buildings there. We sat in the shade of a big, beautiful tree that has been there for probably hundreds of years as Mohammed and another resident of this neighborhood, Skafi Abed, told their side of a very complicated and very debated story that makes it seem like the Israeli government and the Israeli legal system may just have lost their moral compass. Now, I have spent my entire life learning and hearing and studying and living our Jewish and the Israeli narratives. I am passionately committed to the safety and security and right to exist of the State of Israel. I believe that Israel can and must thrive as a Jewish and democratic nation, guided by our highest Jewish values and commitments: justice, peace, equity, fairness, kindness, compassion for all, guided by our Jewish moral GPS. I believe more strongly than ever in the need for a two-state solution, one which will acknowledge and protect the right of self-determination of Israelis and of Palestinians. And I believe that all of us who believe deeply in the Israel of our highest aspirations must stop silencing the voices of Palestinians and those who support them, and instead learn to listen more and talk less. Our moral GPS is there to guide us. It is not about the guilt or responsibility of others. It is about us. It's not about what they have done or what they might do. Our GPS is to guide us, to open our hearts to more empathy and less suspicion, to relinquish once and for all our sense of victimhood, and to recognize when others may be the victims, when we are not treating others as we would want ourselves to be treated, to remember that if we are only for ourselves, well then what are we? On this Day of Atonement, we must recalibrate our moral GPS. We must consider our commitments and our obligations and our future. We are not victims, despite what we have been told. White supremacy, anti-Semitism, acts of violence are on the rise in this time of divisiveness, and yet we need not see ourselves as victims. Yes, there are dangers. There are horrific, tragic attacks on Jews, but we are living in overwhelmingly safety and security here and across most of the globe and in Israel. And we are blessed with prosperity and security. And yes, we are blessed with great power. And with such power comes great responsibility. Certainly, we must first think of ourselves and our families and our community and our people. If we are not for ourselves, who will be for us? Yet if we are only for ourselves, what are we? Jewish obligation calls us to care for others as much as we care for ourselves. For if we do not, we are nothing. If we lose this moral compass, we lose the very essence of what it means to be Jews. Judaism and the Jewish state are only meaningful if we use them to make the world a better place for everyone. Our moral compass calls us to act with moral clarity and purpose. Our moral compass points us towards moral excellence, not mediocrity. It is so easy to ignore your GPS, but do so, and you might just get lost. And a moral GPS is no different. Make excuses and justify why we are treating other people the way we're treating them and criticize others for the failure of their moral GPS. That's how you get lost. You see, that stranger in Cambridge could easily have simply kept driving to wherever he was going, ignoring his moral GPS that told him to stop and help a stranger. But he didn't. We can all find reasons to keep doing whatever we're doing as Americans, as Jews, as humans, even when we know deep inside that it is not right. Perhaps it'll turn out okay, but maybe not. The choice is ours. Rabbi David Hartman casts the choice for Jews and Israel as between listening to the voice of Auschwitz or listening to the voice of Sinai. We can, you see, he says, if we wish, make our victimhood, our fears of those who hate us, our vulnerability, the dominant category of our existence. But doing so, he says, we may lose our way. Hartman suggests that our Jewish moral GPS offers us an alternative to the voice of Auschwitz. He calls this the model of Sinai, a model that awakens the Jewish people to the awesome responsibility of becoming a holy people. At Sinai, he says, we discovered the absolute demand of God. We discover who we are by what we do. Sinai calls us to action, to moral awakening, to living constantly with challenges of building a just and moral society. My friends, faced with a choice between Auschwitz or Sinai, victimhood or the aspiration to moral excellence, I choose Sinai. I want my own life as an American and a Jew and the life of the Jewish people and the life of the Jewish state to be about God's presence in this world, not God's absence. I want my moral compass, our moral compass, to be trained directly on the arc of justice and compassion, leading us towards more good. I will not abandon memory. I will not forget that sometimes we do have enemies, but I want those memories to inspire me and my people and Israel and all of us to a higher purpose. You see, there's no shame in following your moral GPS. There's no shame in American Jews, those of us who care deeply about Israel, demanding and working towards Israel regaining her moral compass. There is no shame in calling out injustice, even in the Jewish state, perhaps especially in the Jewish state. Moments ago, we heard the words of Torah so beautifully read for us, reminding us that God has given us a moral GPS to guide us. Surely, God said, This instruction which I enjoin upon you this day is not too baffling for you, nor is it beyond reach. It is not in the heavens that you should say, who can go up to the heavens and get it for us and impart it to us that we may observe it, nor is it beyond the sea that you should say, who can cross to the other side and get it and give it to us so that we can observe it. No, God says, this thing is very close to you. It's in your mouth. It's in your heart to do it. I call heaven and earth to witness you this day. I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life if you and your offspring would live. The choice is ours. Gemar Chatima Tova. May we all be inscribed for a good year. Amen.